He slammed his fist on the table, eyes blazing with fury, and shouted words no British Prime Minister has ever dared to speak. The monarchy serves Parliament, not the other way around. In that single earth-shattering moment, Britain's centuries-old balance of power shattered like glass. Ministers gasped, aides froze, and across the palace walls of Windsor, the echoes of rebellion began to ring. The Prime Minister didn't just question royal authority yet, he declared war on it. And the fallout, it's not just political, it's historic. It began, as all great crises do, with a whisper of a meeting that should never have happened between King Charles and a figure Westminster thought they'd buried years ago, Nigel Farage. Behind the gilded doors of Windsor Castle, 2 hours of quiet conversation would set the stage for Britain's most dangerous confrontation in 300 years. What were they discussing? Officially nothing. But one leaked document changed everything. A Reform UK memo titled Restoring Britain's Democratic Foundation. It accused Parliament of strangling the very freedoms it claimed to defend. And when Charles reportedly remarked, perhaps it's time for fresh thinking, the current path seems unsustainable. Those 12 words detonated like a political bomb under Downing Street. The monarchy is supposed to stay silent, above politics, untouched by scandal. But silence was no longer an option. The Prime Minister, already cornered by falling poll numbers and party unrest, saw the King's words as a betrayal. Insiders say that during a late-night cabinet meeting, Keir Starmer's composure cracked for the first time in months. He stormed into the room, waving the leaked document like evidence in a trial. Ministers watched as he accused the King, of undermining democracy. If Charles wants to meddle in politics, he thundered, then he'll find out just how brutal politics can be. That line wasn't just anger, it was heresy. The monarchy has outlasted wars, revolutions and recessions because every Prime Minister, from Churchill to Thatcher, knew one rule: you do not attack the crown. But Starmer, exhausted, embittered and losing control of his party, decided to rewrite history in real time. The room fell silent. Not one minister dared to interrupt. Then, as if possessed, Starmer began tearing into Britain's oldest institution, calling it a museum relic and a burden on democracy. For a moment, the air itself seemed to freeze. Could this really be happening? In Britain, of all places. Word of the outburst didn't stay contained for long. By dawn, half the cabinet was whispering. By noon, reporters were circling Westminster like vultures. By sunset, the nation knew the Prime Minister had just insulted the King. Social media erupted. Hashtags like hashtag King Fizz Starmer and hashtag abolish the PM shot to the top of global trends. Memes flooded in. Starmer as Cromwell. Starmer in royal robes. Starmer being knighted by himself. But behind the laughter, something darker was forming. Outrage. The British public, weary of politics but fiercely protective of tradition, turned. Even lifelong Labour supporters began to distance themselves. One retired teacher's TikTok went viral. We can debate policy, but we don't spit on the crown. It wasn't politics anymore. It was sacrilege. Inside number 10, panic set in. Advisors begged Starmer to apologise, to clarify, to blame context or media distortion, but he refused. I meant what I said, he snapped. No man, not even the King, is above Parliament. That line, once spoken with pride by reformers centuries ago, now sounded like a death sentence. His aides exchanged terrified glances because they knew defying the monarchy might win applause in theory, but in Britain, it's suicide in practice. The palace, meanwhile, said nothing, not a word. No statement, no correction, no outrage. And that silence spoke louder than any speech. Every hour the King stayed silent, Starmer's image sank deeper into disgrace. Political commentators called it the most devastating silence in modern British history. Even opposition parties didn't rush to defend him. They didn't need to. He was self-destructing in public view. And while Starmer fought invisible enemies in Downing Street, whispers began to rise in Westminster's corridors. Whispers of resignation letters, whispers of rebellion, whispers of a coup. By the time the Prime Minister realised how deep the cracks had spread, it was already too late. His own ministers had begun meeting privately, so not to discuss policy, but succession. In less than 48 hours, as Starmer had gone from leader to liability, he wasn't governing anymore, he was surviving. And as Britain's institutions trembled, one haunting question echoed across the kingdom. What happens when a Prime Minister declares war on his king and loses? The silence from Buckingham Palace was more powerful than any royal decree. While the Prime Minister burned under the glare of headlines and angry crowds, King Charles played the oldest game in monarchy: restraint. Every advisor urged him to respond, to issue even a brief statement defending the crown, but the king understood something Starmer didn't. Power doesn't always shout, sometimes it waits. And so he waited, calm, quiet, immovable, as the Prime Minister unravelled in front of the world. Each hour Charles said nothing, the outrage grew louder. Every headline, every meme, every viral post painted Starmer as the man who crossed the ultimate line. Britain wasn't watching politics anymore, it was watching history collapse in slow motion. Inside Downing Street, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ministers no longer spoke freely. Aides avoided eye contact. The cabinet, once loyal and orderly, had splintered into rival factions. Some pleaded for a reconciliation with the monarchy. Others whispered that Starmer's downfall was inevitable. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who once defended him at every turn, suddenly fell silent. Angela Rayner, his deputy, was seen entering closed-door meetings with senior MPs, her tone calm, her message consistent. Britain needs stability. That phrase alone spread through Parliament like wildfire. Stability meant change. Change meant Starmer was finished. The press seized on every whisper. The Daily Mail declared Downing Street at war with itself. The Times called it the most dangerous week for British democracy since the abdication crisis. Even the BBC, usually cautious, ran footage of the Prime Minister pacing angrily in his office, captioned, "A leader under siege." Political commentators openly debated whether he would last the month. Some speculated he'd resign before Parliament could turn on him. But Starmer, stubborn as ever, refused to bend. He called it a test of leadership, though everyone around him could see it was something else. Denial. Meanwhile, the King's quiet defiance was winning hearts across the nation. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered, waving Union Jacks and chanting, "Defend the Crown." People who hadn't cared about politics in years now saw the monarchy as the last line of defence against chaos. Royalists, Conservatives, even apolitical citizens united under one emotion: outrage. The monarchy had become a symbol of national unity, while Starmer's government looked like a storm of arrogance and instability. It wasn't about policies anymore, it was about identity, pride and respect. Internationally, the damage was worse. News outlets from Washington to Sydney played clips of Starmer's tirade like a political horror show. The New York Times called it a Prime Minister's royal meltdown. Canadian broadcasters reminded viewers of their own monarchy, subtly framing Charles as the dignified patriarch holding the Commonwealth together. Australia's opposition leader labelled Starmer's comments disgraceful. Diplomats whispered that Britain's credibility had been shaken. In one reckless night, the Prime Minister had turned the world's oldest constitutional monarchy into the world's newest political scandal. Inside the Labour Party, rebellion was no longer a rumour. It was an operation. Secret WhatsApp groups became war rooms. One faction pushed Reeves as the rational economist who could restore order. Another rallied behind Rayner, the fighter who could reconnect with working-class voters. Starmer's name was being erased in real time, replaced by leadership slogans and polling predictions. When Transport Secretary Louise Hay resigned, her letter went viral for one chilling sentence: "I will not serve a leader who wages war on his king." It was over, though Starmer refused to admit it. Each resignation was another crack in the dam, and everyone knew what came next: a flood. By Friday evening, the palace lights glowed brighter than usual. Rumours swirled of an emergency meeting, not with politicians, but with constitutional advisors. Some said the king was considering invoking powers unused in modern times, powers that could dissolve Parliament if the crisis deepened. Was it true? No one knew. But the speculation alone was enough to send tremors through Westminster. If the king acted, it would be the first time since the 1830s. If he stayed silent, Starmer might drag Britain further into the abysses. Either way, the kingdom stood on the edge. And as the Prime Minister stared out his window into the London night, surrounded by silence, betrayal, and the faint hum of protesters chanting his downfall, one truth became impossible to ignore. He hadn't just lost control of his government, he'd lost the nation's soul. But what the king was about to do next would make every scandal before this look like child's play. Could Charles really break centuries of restraint and strike back? Or would his next move change Britain forever? The morning that followed was unlike any Britain had seen in generations. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the tension of something irreversible. Newspapers hit the stands with front pages screaming of betrayal, defiance and collapse. "The Crown strikes back," read the Telegraph. "Starmer versus Charles, the final showdown," thundered the Mirror. No one could tell what was fact, what was speculation, or what was pure panic. But one thing was certain, the invisible line that had kept Britain stable for 3 centuries had been crossed, and there was no going back. The monarchy had been provoked, humiliated, and now, according to whispers from Windsor, it was preparing to respond. Inside the palace, aides moved in silence. Curtains were drawn, calls were taken in coded language, and every conversation ended with the same uneasy phrase: "The king will decide." For days, Charles had watched events unfold with the calm of a man who understood that time itself was his greatest weapon, but that calm was about to change. Reports surfaced of a confidential audience with senior constitutional scholars, advisors, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The discussion, insiders claimed, was not about diplomacy or apology, and it was about consequence. Could the monarch, under the royal prerogative, still dismiss a prime minister who defied the crown? The answer, though buried under centuries of dusty precedent, was yes. Rare, dangerous, but yes. And that single word sent Westminster into full-blown hysteria. Downing Street, meanwhile, had descended into chaos. Starmer's once loyal communications team was in open revolt. Statements were being drafted, redrafted, and scrapped altogether. Ministers refused to appear on television. Press officers were resigning mid-shift. The Prime Minister's authority had collapsed, not with a bang, but a slow, agonising unravelling. Parliament's corridors buzzed with plotting. The Speaker of the House reportedly warned the government that the stability of the realm was in question, a phrase not heard in Britain since the 1936 abdication crisis. In the Commons, opposition MPs heckled Starmer mercilessly, chanting, "Long live the King." As he stood pale and trembling behind the dispatch box, he tried to respond, but every word sounded defensive, hollow, almost frightened. And then came the leak that sealed his fate. An anonymous source within the palace confirmed to several outlets that King Charles had sought guidance on his constitutional options, including the power to dissolve Parliament. It was enough to spark pandemonium. Crowds swarmed outside Buckingham Palace, waving banners that read, "Protect the Crown" and "Not my Prime Minister." Outside Downing Street, the chants were the opposite: democracy first and no king above the people. Britain's streets had turned into 2 camps of conviction, both shouting for freedom, both convinced the other was the enemy. Foreign governments were quietly panicking. The US State Department issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in Britain's democratic institutions. Diplomatic code for what on earth is happening in London. Meanwhile, markets began to wobble. The pound fell sharply. Investors pulled back. It was as though the world had suddenly realised that the United Kingdom, that bastion of calm and order, was now the world's most unpredictable democracy. And at the heart of it all stood 2 men, a king who refused to bow and a prime minister who refused to blink. Starmer tried to fight back. He went on television for what aides promised would be a measured and dignified address. But when the cameras rolled, dignity vanished. The Prime Minister looked exhausted, eyes hollow, voice trembling. He accused the palace of coordinating political interference, warning that Britain was on the brink of monarchical overreach. It was meant to sound brave. Instead, it sounded desperate. Commentators compared it to a man shouting at a storm. Within minutes, social media exploded again. Clips of the speech were edited, remixed and ridiculed. One viral caption summed it up perfectly. He's fighting a king, not a campaign. At that moment, Starmer's isolation became total. The Labour backbenchers who once idolised him now treated him like a liability. Angela Rayner publicly called for calm leadership, code for resign now. Rachel Reeves offered a cryptic post on X. Respect for institutions is the foundation of democracy. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew who she meant. The knives weren't just out, they were already twisting. Meanwhile, for sources close to Windsor claimed that the king had made up his mind. The details were kept under lock and key, but courtiers whispered about a statement of intent being prepared in strict secrecy. The word address appeared in the palace schedule for the following evening, with no topic listed. Broadcasters cleared airtime, security tightened around royal grounds. Something extraordinary was about to happen. By dusk, the country held its breath. Every television set was on. Every pub was silent. Every living room frozen in anticipation. Was the king about to dismiss the prime minister? Could Britain really witness a modern-day royal intervention? The idea seemed impossible until suddenly it didn't. And as the clock struck 8 and the palace lights dimmed, a single phrase appeared on every screen across the nation. His Majesty the King will address the nation. And that was when Britain realised that the war between Crown and Parliament was about to turn from words into action. But what would the King actually say? Would he demand Starmer's resignation or something far more shocking? The nation froze. The royal crest appeared on screens across Britain and a solemn drumroll faded into silence. King Charles III sat alone in the centre of Buckingham Palace's grand study. The same room where Queen Elizabeth once spoke during times of national crisis. The air was heavy, the symbolism unmistakable. This was not ceremony. This was history being rewritten live. The king looked calm, composed, but his eyes told another story. A quiet fury mixed with deep sorrow. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. For 300 years, he began. The British Crown and Parliament have stood together, not as rivals, but as partners in the service of the people. That partnership has been tested, but never broken, until now. Those words alone sent shockwaves through the nation. Was the king about to do the unthinkable? He continued, speaking slowly, deliberately, every word measured like a legal verdict. Recent events have endangered not only the dignity of this institution, but the unity of our nation. It is my duty to preserve. Both viewers across Britain sat motionless, barely breathing. And then came the line that would make front page history, that after consultation with my advisors and in accordance with my constitutional responsibilities, I have communicated to the Prime Minister my expectation that he tender his resignation. The words were soft, not shouted, not dramatic, yet they hit like thunder. The King had just dismissed the Prime Minister. For the first time in modern British history, the Crown had publicly intervened to remove the head of government. Parliament, the press, the public, everyone was stunned. Within minutes, Downing Street was in meltdown. Advisors scrambled. Phones rang endlessly, and Starmer, pale and furious, refused to believe what he had just heard. He can't do that, he muttered again and again, pacing like a man trapped in his own nightmare. But constitutionally, he was wrong. The king had acted within his prerogative, a power long buried under democratic convention, but never erased. The same ancient authority once used by monarchs in times of grave crisis had just been revived in 2025. Outside number 10. The 10, protesters erupted into cheers and outrage alike. Half the crowd chanting, "God save the king," the other half screaming, "Democracy dies tonight." The nation was no longer divided by party or class. It was split by loyalty itself. News networks went into overdrive. BBC anchors looked visibly shaken. Sky News broke the story with the headline, "Crown ends the Starmer era." The Guardian called it a constitutional earthquake. Within an hour, opposition leaders were demanding an emergency election. Some called the King's move courageous, others called it catastrophic. Constitutional scholars filled panels arguing over legality, ethics and history. But the public didn't care about the footnotes of law. They were witnessing a drama older than Parliament itself, the power of the Crown reborn in real time. By midnight, Starmer finally left Downing Street for what many believed was the last time. Cameras captured his car under flashing lights, speeding through the London rain, headed for a private residence outside the city. He gave no statement, no wave, no acknowledgement of defeat. Only a few loyal aides followed him. The rest had already resigned. The man who once promised to modernise Britain had been undone by the oldest force in its history, the monarchy. And while political analysts debated whether the King's intervention was right or wrong, one fact was undeniable. The British people had chosen their side, and it wasn't Starmer's. At Buckingham Palace, the King's image was being projected onto buildings, framed in candlelight vigils, and splashed across front pages with the words, "The monarch who acted." For some, he was a saviour. For others, a tyrant cloaked in tradition. But even his critics admitted one thing. He had done what no one else had dared to do. Restore the Crown's power. When Parliament lost its way, the old order of silent monarchs was gone. This was Charles as his ancestors once were. Not a figurehead, but a force. And yet behind the grandeur and applause there was unease, because every time a king exercises forgotten power, history whispers the same warning. Power, once awakened, never sleeps quietly again. As dawn broke over London, the Union Jack flew at half-mast over Parliament. Not for a death, but for the end of an era. The political system that had defined Britain for centuries had been shaken to its core, in cafes and classrooms, pubs and palaces. People asked the same haunting question. What comes next? Would elections restore order or plunge the nation into deeper chaos? Would the monarchy retreat once more into slurns, or was this the beginning of a new royal age? One where the king ruled not just in ceremony, but in spirit. And as the cameras panned out across the misty skyline of Westminster, one question echoed louder than the rest. The question history will judge them all by: when the Prime Minister declared war on the monarchy. Did he lose his crown, or did Britain lose its democracy?